So we made our thread, we made our weave, and now we'd like to embroider ornaments on top of this plain base to make it look more appealing and interesting. We have two tasks ahead of us. We need to create the embroidery weave that will be added to our base fabric, and we need to create an ornament mask that will basically tell designer where the embroidery should appear. And since all you need in the end is a black and white image, you could also simply load something that you got elsewhere or just draw it manually in Photoshop, for example. This is important, I will go back to this later, but you don't necessarily have to do everything procedurally in Designer. Now, for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to create our ornament mask from scratch by ourselves just because it's a great exercise to get used to shape creation and manipulation. But in the next video, I will also show you the other technique where you just import a bitmap and use it as a ready-made mask. And at the end, we'll weigh the pros and cons of each method. Alright, let's first see how we can make this mask procedurally. We need some space for that, and I could just move away from the main arrangement here and start building something on the side. Or if I want to keep things really tidy and, I don't want this node arrangement to get in the way, what I could do is build it in a separate graph, or what we call a subgraph. Now you remember when we started a project, Designer created for us a Substance package. And this package is like a box in which we can add as many resources as we like. In our case, we only have this ornate fabric graph here. That is just our main graph. Now, in order to add a new graph to our project, we need to come over to the package here where it says .sbs. Make sure you are clicking the package and not the graph. People often get confused by that. So on the package, right-click, go to New, Substance Graph. It's going to ask you the same thing that when we first started our project. So which template you want to use, what resolution you want to work on, and so on. We're going to keep everything at default and just rename the graph Ornaments. Don't be confused by that. It's not going to create a new project. It's just going to add another graph inside your current project. And there we go. We now have a nice clean slate to start building our mask. And the good thing about doing it this way in a separate space like that is, well, first, we're not going to clutter our main graph, so that's always a good thing. And second, the fact that the ornament mask is now its own entity means we can always bring it in other projects. Okay, so let's start building it. Now it's time to ask ourselves, what kind of ornament do we want to make? It could be flowers, it could be stars, hearts, geometrical patterns. But even if you don't know exactly what you want to make, Designer can be a good starting point. So let's say I don't really know where I'm heading and I just want to doodle until I find something that sticks. I'm going to start with a simple shape, like a disc, for instance. But apart from changing its size, I'm pretty limited when it comes to deforming it or creating something new out of it. So let's search for a node that could help us with that. If we type in warp, you see that we have a whole family of nodes dedicated to just that. Let's start with the simple warp, the one with that wobbly grid here. All right, so what the warp does, if we look at its description, is that it displaces the pixel of an image following an intensity map that you plug right here. So let me show you an example real quick. If I connect my disk to it and use another shape as the intensity input, and use a transform 2D to move it around, you can see that the pixels of my disk are shifted based on where my shape is. Now notice that I'm using a bell shape for that because it has a nice soft gradient. And if you look at the intensity input of the warp, it actually says gradient input. And what that means is that it's not going to work very well with sharp inputs. See, if I change my bell to something harsher, I lose the clean distortions that I had. So keep in mind, when using the warp, you need to choose soft shapes and noises for the intensity. Now, when it comes to noises, I already know that something like the purlin noise will work well. Because it has these large blobs with gentle slopes, it's the perfect candidate for a warp. So let's just plug it in. Now, if I play with the purlin properties while previewing the warp, for example, let's say I change the disorder. Well, I can now see it ripple through the disk outline in real time, which is awesome. Now, I'd like to make a few adjustments. First, I'd like to make the purlin larger and the warp more intense by typing in 2 here. Okay. Now at this stage, it's just a shapeless blob, and I wouldn't call it an ornament really, but here's a few tricks we can do to turn it into something interesting. The main thing that is missing here is harmony. If we think of harmony as a balance between chaos and order. Right now we have a lot of chaos here coming from the noise randomness, and we have zero order. One quick and easy way to structure this would be to add a mirror. The mirror node does exactly what it says. It will mirror the input on the axis of your choice, or you can also mirror the corners. So I'm just going to cycle through these until I have something interesting. Okay, now let's move that node to the side. And what we will do to refine this result is add a couple more nodes in between here. Now let's select the connection first, then search for swirl. This one will distort your input like so, like following a spiral shape. And I usually scale it up by 2 by clicking here, so it's taking in the whole image, then play with the amount to make it more or less intense. Okay, I'm not going to tweak it too much now because I first want to finish my little setup, and I will do that by just adding a transform 2D here, just to be able to test different looks simply by moving around my shape before it enters the mirror. Now with everything set up, I can finally double-click my mirror to display it in the 2D view, then start playing with some of the previous nodes. So I can move the shape around, experiment with the swirl. I can even go back to the very beginning and change the base disk. Also maybe play with the purlin. And just keep going like that. Now this really illustrates the power of making things procedurally, because here we didn't create one static image, but we actually made a dynamic generator that can produce endless variations. And it's also a good illustration of what we mean when we say that the workflow in Designer is non-linear. We can act upon any point of the graph, and it will just update everything that is connected to it. So I can go back and forth between my mirror, my transform, the noise, and so on. And now I have this nice shape. Alright, so that was one way of creating custom shapes in Substance Designer. Now let's say you don't want to generate just random shapes because you have a specific design in mind and you want to be able to reproduce it procedurally with more control. You could get there using warps, but it would quickly get tedious. Instead, I'm going to introduce you to a new family of nodes. So let's move away from this first setup and type in spline. Now the spline nodes are a big family. You can spot them with that yellow color code. To get started, let's bring in the spline polyquadratic node. Okay, now this one looks very different from what we've been using so far. And with all of these inputs and outputs, it can be a bit intimidating. But let me reassure you right away, you don't have to worry about them. You will not have to use them separately. Speaking of it, if I want to grab any of the outputs, you see that they all come together for me, but you may have a different behavior where they only come one by one. If that's the case, it's because you are in the wrong connection mode. That's a setting you can change by going at the top of the toolbar here, where it says Link Creation Mode. And we have different modes here, and if I set it to standard, you see it will only let me grab connections one by one, and we don't want that. So make sure you are in material mode if you want to follow along. Okay, back to our spline. Now, like I said, you can ignore these inputs for now, so let's focus on the 2D view. So we have a spline here. We can just pose it however we want with these 4 points and just drag them around like so. And that's mostly it. You can just draw any shape by moving points. We can go up to 10 points in our polyquadratic. You can even go above it using the point list node. We won't get into that. For now, I just encourage you to spend a few minutes just messing around with the points to familiarize yourself with the node. Now, in my case, I'd like to create some kind of stylized leaf shape or blade. I'm just going to experiment with it a bit. Something nice. All right. Now, at this point, all we see in the 2D view is a preview. It is not the actual output that we are going to use. And you can already tell that if you scroll at the bottom of the properties panel here, you have all these preview settings like the point size, the thickness, and so on. It's just here to help us see what we're doing. So I made this sort of leaf blade thing, and I'd like to see it in its final form and not just as a preview. So how can I get out of preview mode? There are different nodes I can use for that. So we have spline render, spline mapper, but I'm going to use the scatter on spline grayscale for that. That's another big node, but don't worry, we're not going to dive too deep into it. Now to connect our spline to it, all we have to do is take one input and it will just hook the whole bundle here. All right, now it's giving us this result with all these disks scattered along the spline. That's not exactly what we want. So we are going to take that shape spacing slider and push it down to 0. And now we have something nice and smooth. The second parameter we need to change is in the size section. So we need to switch the size mode here at the top from normal to use thickness from spline. Now all of a sudden our image has disappeared, and that's because the spline we use doesn't have any thickness yet. So we just need to go back to it and see that's some nonlinear workflow in action here. And if we take a look at the properties, we see that each point of the spline actually has its own properties, including thickness. And if I start gently pushing some of these sliders, I instantly see the results updating in my scatter. So now let me tweak these a bit until I have the desired look. Nice and tapered. Okay. Something like that. All right, so I made a first blade using this spline node, but what if I wanted to have some sort of clump with several blades? I would need several splines for that. Now you might be thinking, sure, no problem, we can just create another one and blend them together. But the thing is, splines are a separate category of object in Designer, and you can't really blend them like you would with ordinary shapes or noises. Instead, what you can do is append them in a list. Now it sounds complex, but it's actually very simple. All you have to do is first you need several splines. So let me just duplicate this one by pressing Ctrl D. And now to assemble these, you can just take the outputs of the first spline and connect it to the second one. And now our two splines are grouped in one list. I can render them all together like so, but they're still separate entities that I can readjust individually. So I'm going to do that a couple more times, duplicating, reconnecting, giving different poses. All right, so you now know how to create specific shapes using splines. It's a bit more advanced, but definitely worth it when you want to have more control over your shapes. To finish this little plant setup, I'd like to add a flower somewhere in the middle. Something really simple and stylized, a bit like the famous rose designed by Macintosh, which is just a round base that is crisscrossed with petal lines. That should be fairly easy. I'm going to start with a disk, then add a transform 2D to place it. And here I'm just using a blend to guide me and see things better, somewhere around here. Okay, now for the petal lines, I'm going to use two more nodes. First, I like to be able to extract the outline of this disk here, just to have a nice empty circle. And I can use an edge detect for that. This node just traces the contour of the input and it's very handy. There's not much to change here. We can invert it, can adjust the thickness if needed. And now what I would like is to take this circle and scatter it randomly. And I'm going to use a tile generator for that because we already know that node, so it will be a good practice. Remember, we need to change the pattern to image input. Then I'm going to reduce the number to something like 3 and play with the scale and position until I get something nice and random. Okay, now once it's done, I can take the very basic bud we've been making and blend these random circles on top of it in subtract mode. Then now we can adjust and fine-tune things. For example, I could play with the tile generator random seed. Now it still feels a bit too uniform, and to be honest, it just reminds me of a basketball. A quick fix for that would be to throw a warp somewhere in here to just break that perfect round shape. So let's just grab a warp, grab a purling noise as well, and experiment with them a bit. I'm going to tweak the scale. and adjust the intensity. All right. Now, if I redirect it here, like so, we have to keep in mind that it's going to affect the edge detect as well. So in this case, it's fine, but sometimes you have to think ahead about where you want a certain effect to appear. Now let's tweak the tile random seed one last time. Okay. Our stylized flower is now finished, and all that is left to do is to combine it with our little setup here. And this time we can use a blend for that. So let's set it to max because we want to add our flower. And voila! One thing bothers me though, now that I look at it, and that's the fact that we can see the blades behind the flower. And I wish the flower would just completely hide what's behind. There are different ways we can fix this, but the one I would like to show you is by using the opacity input of the blend. So far, we haven't really used it, but it can really take your work in Designer to the next level, so you better get used to it early on. So, the first thing I will do is actually change the blending mode and set it back to copy. Copy is basically saying that the foreground will completely take over the background. You can think of it as a replace mode. Now our flower replaces the blades. But I'd like to be more precise. I'd like to tell the blend, okay, let the flower take over the rest, but only in a certain area. I don't want it to override everything. I just want it to happen in a small portion. What I could do is take the flower itself and use it as a mask. But since the mask here and the input here are exactly the same, we can't see any difference from when we were blending in max mode. So in order for it to work, I will need to expand the mask a little so that it floods these interstices here. And this is something that is actually pretty easy to do. If I take a blur, so blur HQ here, HQ for high quality, and connect my flower to it, I now have these gradients on the edges that I can scan, so to say. So I could use a levels for that, but since it's pretty basic, I'm going to use a smaller and very handy node, that is the threshold node. This node just picks a grayscale value and turns white everything that is above it and black everything that is under it. And so you can easily adjust the effect with this slider. All right. I now have a nice inflated mask that I can use to drive the blend here. So let's just try it. And there you go. You can really see how it's cutting out the background where the flower is. And now I can just move it around and the mask will keep following. I can also adjust it by either playing with the blur or with the threshold. Alright, so in this video we saw how you can create custom shapes by warping them and by leveraging the noise's randomness. We also went through a more controlled and advanced process using splines, which let us achieve more precise results. And both of these examples are great at showing how working in Designer is really a back and forth process. It's not linear, it's all about building a small setup, then testing it, then going back to the previous nodes, making a few changes, and seeing how it impacts your final result. So it may look like a lot of work, but it's definitely worth it when you want to have something that is dynamic and customizable. In the next video, we will see how you can import ready-made images if you want to skip that procedural phase.